Hello and welcome to this video on factors contributing to globalization. So let's start off with a quick reminder of what is globalization. Well, according to the IMF, globalization is defined as the process through which an increasingly free flow of ideas, people, goods, services and capital leads to the integration of economies and societies. Perhaps put more simply, it's the increasing ability for companies to produce any good or service anywhere in the world using raw materials, components, capital, and technology from anywhere, sell the resulting output anywhere, and place the profits anywhere. A good example would be Apple and the iPhone. If you look at the manufacturers of the components that go into an iPhone, you can see they come from a really wide variety of different countries. So, for example, the memory comes from South Korea. There are parts from Taiwan, United States, Italy, Japan. The things are all assembled in China. And so there's a complex process here that's going on where bits are moving around the world being assembled and then these are being sold in markets around the world. And it's a good example of a globalized process. 40, 50 years ago, Apple would have been basing or manufacturing all of their products at home in the US. So what does a globalized world involve? Well, it's a process, globalization, a process in which economies become increasingly integrated, so joined up, and also interdependent, reliant on each other. We need to be aware that it's a dynamic process rather than an end state. It's constantly evolving and constantly changing. The final point is globalization is not inevitable. It can reverse, and we often call this deglobalization. And you would argue that in recent years following the global financial crisis, there's been a reduction in the growth of trade in goods and services, and certain recent elections in the USA would again suggest that there may be a process of deglobalization in the future. So in this video, we're going to look at what is meant by globalization, which we've kind of already covered, and then look at the 8 factors that we need to be aware of that have contributed to an increasingly globalized world. So let's start off with a bit more on what does globalization and a globalized world look like. Well, if we go around the clock here, an increasingly globalized world sees much more trade between countries, and the amount of trade compared to the size of what's being produced in total is increasing as the world becomes more globalized. We also see an expansion of the amount of financial capital, so money and investment flowing between countries. An example of this would be increasing levels of FDI, both inward and outward between countries, and also cross-border deals, so buying or merging with foreign companies. A globalized world, well, we see a number of global brands emerging, so like Coca-Cola and Google, McDonald's, but also countries like Korea with Samsung, and even more so maybe recently China and Lenovo. A more globalized world encourages deeper specialization of labor. So nations, individuals, businesses become very focused at doing one particular task very well and benefit from specialized skill and economies of scale. As a result, components to make many products these days come from many different nations, as we saw with the iPhone earlier on. So we have global supply chains. For example, Apple get products from a vast variety of different countries and then assemble them. We've got new investment routes as well opening up as countries become more engaged in the global economy. So a lot more developing economies trading with each other, which we might describe as Southern Hemisphere or South-South trade. Increasing levels of international labour migration, so people moving from different countries to look for work and to provide their skills. And then lastly, an increasing connectivity of people. So technology allowing people to communicate more freely around the world, again, would be an indication of this free flow of ideas and a more globalized planet. So we've looked a bit at what is meant by globalization in the first few minutes. Now let's go on to look at the 8 factors that have contributed to increased globalization. First up, number 1 is trade liberalization. And this is the removal of trade barriers. And trade barriers are rules or restrictions on the amount of trade that can take place or the value of trade between countries. An organization that's had a large impact in trade liberalization, or a large proponent of trade liberalization, would be the World Trade Organization, sometimes known as the WTO. And they're an organization where countries, governments go and meet and discuss issues over trade, and they really try and push countries to agree to remove restrictions on the number of imports or the number of exports, or things like taxes on imports. So this has led to reduced tariffs, and a tariff is a tax on imports, although there are still many hurdles to overcome in terms of a lot of tariffs do still exist, and there are still some quotas and restrictions on trade. The increased freedom of movement of goods and services allows increased opportunities for export, and this has an impact on GDP within these countries. Some of the benefits and drawbacks of trade liberalization: well, it allows more trade, so allows specialization to take place and therefore increased output. If there's more stuff to go around, then you might argue there'd be a higher standard of living, and therefore also a greater choice for people as they can buy from different countries, and if they are more efficient, then at lower prices. Perhaps greater quality products, and increased competition within markets. Some of the drawbacks of trade liberalization: well, if that allows trade to be diverted from one country to another country, then there may be unemployment as a result if particular industries, domestic industries, suffer. If there's increasing trade, this may lead to increasing transportation, and so there might be environmental concerns. What is the carbon footprint of all the trade that's taking place? Trade liberalization may allow foreign, large, powerful companies to enter a smaller country's market and completely dominate that market and undercut or eliminate the competition. Similarly, governments may not be able to protect what we might call infant industries. So these are industries that are starting out in the early stages, for example, something like renewable energy industry, and the government might want to protect it from larger competition overseas through things like tariffs and quotas, but they can't do that because of trade liberalization. Okay, our second cause of globalization is to do with political change. So many large and rapidly developing countries, so we're thinking here about Russia and China, were previously closed to trade. So if you go back 40, 50 years, China was very isolationist in terms of its policies. It wanted to be self-sufficient and didn't want to really engage with other economies around the world. Following the decline in communism around the world, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening up of China, these countries have now become much more part of the global economy. They've created new markets for products and also provided a lot of low-cost labour. They've also contributed to economic growth around the world by buying imports from other countries and also selling exports to these countries. Both the BRICS countries and the MINT countries have substantial natural and human resources that can contribute to globalization, and increasingly the governments within those countries are allowing businesses and entrepreneurs within those countries to do deals with foreigners, to allow foreign companies to sell into those markets and to promote exporting goods and services to other foreign countries around the world. Okay, our third cause is reduced transportation and communication costs. So the first thing to consider here is maybe a phenomenon known as containerization, and that is to do with these big container boxes that you might see on large ocean tankers. Now these are all of a standard shape and dimensions, so whatever ship they go on and whichever port they go into, they should be able to deal with them. And generally speaking, the costs of ocean shipping have come down dramatically due to things like economies of scale, the size of the ships, containerization, shipping things in bulk. And bringing the cost of transport down has made trade more attractive. It's made it more efficient. It's made it more cost effective. So the price of the products that are being shipped when they arrive in the, the market that they're due for, they more closely match the price that you would expect to pay within the country they've come from, because the shipping cost is lower. There's also been lots of improvements in air travel as well, which has facilitated lots of travel between countries and also transportation of maybe smaller goods. Okay, improvements in infrastructure, so for example, roads and the internet, has also made globalization, global supply chains, and moving products to different markets a lot easier. And lastly, the improvements in terms of communications, so things like the internet, the availability and the cost effectiveness now of mobile technology makes it quicker and easier to communicate, which means it's easier to coordinate a global supply chain. If you think of Apple making their iPhone, all these different countries, bits need to be sent to various different countries. It's important that you're able to communicate with these different businesses. If you imagine trying to do that without the internet or without mobile technology, it would be very, very tricky. So these improvements in technology and communications have allowed globalization to take place. Okay, number 4 is the increased significance of global companies. So many companies around the world have decided to branch out into foreign markets to pursue higher revenue and profit growth. And this has been particularly the case into markets where there are growing numbers of middle class consumers. And we would describe these businesses that operate in lots of different countries around the world as multinational companies or maybe transnational companies, MNCs or TNCs. So McDonald's would be a good example. And as they've expanded to different markets around the world, they bring with them ways of business practice. They involve a lot more shipping of supplies. They kind of share ideas and culture and stuff like that. So the increased significance and emergence of global companies has contributed to the more globalized world that we live in today. Okay, number 5 is increased investment flows. So around the world, a number of countries have made it easier for people and businesses to move money in and out of their countries. If we look at China as an example again, if you go back 30, 40 years, it's actually quite difficult to move money into China if you wanted to expand your business. And if you made a profit, quite difficult to move the money back out. Now, more recently, they've made it a lot easier to move large amounts of money in and out of China. And so this allows more FDI, more foreign direct investment. So, for example, Western businesses can expand their operations into China or other developing countries. So we've seen, generally speaking, an increase in FDI around the world. If we look at the chart on the left-hand side, we can see that broadly speaking, there's an upward trend in the level of FDI around the world. Although there are periods of time in 2000, perhaps because of 9/11 and 2001, and the global financial crisis, when this trend doesn't bear out and flows can be reduced. So they are quite sensitive to what's going on in the global economy, but generally speaking, over time, these investment flows have increased. So businesses can pursue investments in other countries, and this again contributes to the world becoming more globalized. Okay, number 6 is migration. So this chart in the background is potentially quite confusing, but what we can see is the movement, particularly in green, of migrant workers. So we can see workers moving from regions in Asia over to the Middle East. Down here we can see workers moving from Eastern Europe into countries in the EU. And so migration is a feature of a globalized world. So we might argue that in a globalized world, these days, workers are more willing to move across national borders in search of employment. Also, there have been some movements in the world to allow free movement of labour, for example, in the EU. A reduction in travel costs and improved infrastructure has also made it more possible for migration to take place. Globalization allows people to move quickly, and if you're talented and you are skillful, then you can move to a country where you have maybe higher earning potential or more stimulating job, which we often describe as being a brain drain, where young talented workers move to different countries. It doesn't just work for the most talented, also less skilled workers can move to countries where they can undercut in terms of their wage demands the local workforce. So increased levels of migration, again, we would say maybe have contributed to globalization. Number 7 is related. It's the growth of the global labour force. So if you look at the labour force within Britain, you can see in this chart down here where a number of those are economic migrants, so immigrants from other countries. So we can see large numbers perhaps from Poland or from India. And we would say describe now that in many situations businesses are looking to hire not just from one particular country, but can hire staff from around the world. So the quantity and quality of the workforce has caused many companies to have quite diverse international workforces. Again, it can apply to low-skilled workers entering industries and also high-skilled workers entering industries. Okay, our final contribution towards globalization is to do with structural change. And that is related to economies moving away from primary sector, so things like agriculture, more towards manufacturing, or other economies have moved towards from the secondary sector towards things like services and what we might describe as kind of a knowledge-based economy. So as these countries have changed what they've been focusing on, they have become more involved in the global economy. So we would argue maybe that structural change within economies has contributed to globalization. So in this video, we've looked at what is meant by globalization, and we've also looked at 8 factors that have contributed to the world becoming more globalized. That's it. Thank you very much.